What is their real interest? Is their real interest to go to the WTO and say, listen, Toyota and Honda are using transfer payments or subsidizing in some other way the production of their car, and that's hurting us. I really question that, especially when GM owns Dawood, which I guess is a big conglomerate in Hyundai, or not Hyundai, but that produces vehicles in Korea, and now we have a free trade agreement with Korea. So one professor I had said he thinks that Ford and Chrysler will disappear in our lifetime, and that GM will begin importing cars through their Korean subsidiary. But the bottom line is this. Domestic industry, that's how it's termed under the WTO treaty. I think we could change the law in the United States if we got a big enough majority to say that labor gets to come and represent itself as domestic industry at the WTO, and that once they have come together and made their argument, that the United States has no choice but to take that argument to the WTO. That way, because what's really happened with the WTO, and the big problem with it, is that I don't get to go there. It's not like our court system where somebody does something wrong, I get to go to court. Or you get to go, or the labor unions, just only this certain little class of people get to go, and they're called domestic industry. And they have to run the domestic industry, and then on top of it, once they get their arguments together, they have to convince the president, who may or may not be very sympathetic to those arguments for whatever reason. It's a stripping away of our democratic rights, and I think somehow we have to figure out a way so that we can get back into the court and into the game. And if you got into the game, then labor could come in. Maybe labor loses at the WTO. Maybe they don't win. But it's some way to get us back in. So that's the second sort of liberal position that I can identify very quickly for you. And that can be done by us, because I think we can define in our own legislation in this country that we are, this is what we're going to define as domestic industry, and the president must act upon it. That will give people they'll give them standing, and that's what you need when you go to court. And I don't know if you've heard that or not. You need standing to bring your issue to court. You have to be the injured party. I think labor unions have been injured. Environmentalists don't have standing either. They're all considered NGOs, and they've been, in particular, excluded. And just to show you that I'm not a crazy conspiratorial theorist about how bad things are, Monsanto, the Europeans don't like genetically modified food, and they don't like hormones in their beef. And so they've said that they're not going to have either of those things in their country. Well, Monsanto ran off, convinced the United States to run off and file a trade complaint against Europe at the WTO. Well, the head of Monsanto Europe ends up being the one who gets to appoint all of the panel people to make the decision. So what do you think the decision came down? I mean, it was that Europe was doing something illegally. So it is a very, very perverse system. It has a lot of problems. It was developed, as I said, the ideas behind it were developed right after World War II. They're not modern institutions. But we as liberals have to take this on, because if we're not engaged in the free trade debate, then we really aren't contributing anything to this globalization debate and how it's really shaping up. And ultimately, we're all going to be the victims of it. So there's some additional issues, and I'll shut up, and anybody who has a question can ask it to me. But there is at least one good WTO decision, and that is, in my mind, it's good. A decision, it was called Shrimp Turtle. It had to do with whether you could drown turtles while you were harvesting shrimp, or whether you had to have these turtle excluder nets. And at first it looked like it was going to be the tuna case, which is, you know what, if they want to drown turtles all over the world while they're harvesting tuna and they go extinct, well, that's just the way it is, because shrimp is shrimp is shrimp, and we can't exclude shrimp because turtles are or are not hurt in it. What the WTO said at that point in time, however, was if a country who imposes that sort of standard pays for a poor country or a country that doesn't have that technology to use that technology, and that country doesn't use the technology, we can exclude those sorts of products. So that actually is, in my mind, the best of all worlds, because when you're trying to save wildlife in an international setting, what you want to do is get everybody else to do it. And that's the reason why we have the trade barriers in the first place, is because we want to force changes in other people's behavior. So by doing that, what we're saying is, if we could pass more laws like that and say, we know we're going to have to pay at the WTO, we'll say, we know we have to pay for these other, we could use our foreign aid so that they're actually getting the technology to save the resources to do it. And along those same lines, just so you're aware of what's kind of going on in the seas are being fished just to pieces. I mean, animals are disappearing left, right, center. I mean, and the reason why is we're using sonar, and we can practically get every single fish. We can identify with sonar where all the fish are, where they are, how we get them. So what is happening is most of the countries in the world subsidize their fishing industries. And there is at least a part of a treaty coming up where the idea of taking subsidies away from the fishing industry is part of that you can't subsidize. And the WTO has a provision where it's really trying to cut down on subsidies because they consider that to be the biggest perverting factor. And what's happening is countries are all paying for their fishing fleets to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and more of the fish are disappearing, and under the kind of tragedy of the commons. I don't know if you've heard that, but it's where we all share a resource and nobody owns it, and so everybody has the incentive to use the resource up faster than everybody else. That's what's happening. So we've got to use the WTO to begin to hone back these subsidies. And along the same lines, and this is going to be a big challenge for Democrats, is to figure out how we do that in the context of farming. Because our farming subsidies are causing people to starve in other parts of the world. We subsidize so heavily our food. I don't know if anybody saw the story recently about CARE refusing to accept our wheat. And they CARE, which is I think one of the largest food aid places, said, we don't want the wheat anymore. Because the problem is the African farmer can't even produce food cheap enough to make a living when this free food is being dumped into Africa. And so you are undermining the ability of Africans to essentially feed themselves or having any farming industry, and the result is starvation, lack of farming, lack of progress, lack of an economic growth, and that is all under the ruse that we're helping them. Now, against that backdrop, and this is why it's tough for Democrats, is we know from the Great Depression that you don't have some farm support, things get out of control. And so I think to look at how the Europeans have their subsidies set up rather than how we have our subsidies set up is very important. It creates more open space. It creates more family farmers rather than huge corporate farmers. And there is ways to begin to take some of this money off, some money out of the system so that we're actually using that to subsidize, in my mind, third world farmers. Rather than giving them food aid, we're trying to bring them up to a level playing field. Because the idea behind the WTO is that subsidies are illegal. You're creating an unfair trade advantage. It's like putting up a barrier. You're doing the same thing we were doing to the Japanese prior to World War II. We don't want your products in. We don't want you to have fuel. We don't want to. You're creating huge problems. And that's the economic problem that's in Africa today. And they just don't have the ability to fight back. They have no ability to raise their own food. So that's a huge, big issue if you really care about people. I mean, obviously there's politics involved in this and everything else, but export subsidies, we really have to work on them going away. And I think we have to work on creating subsidies in this country that help small farmers produce open space close to cities, which can be done, because that's what they have in Europe. When you go to Europe, you see all these beautiful little farms right next to most cities. And not subsidies that create massive amount of food in the world that ultimately undermine people. So those are kind of my really quick sort of thoughts. Yeah.